All right, everyone, we'll get started. So I'm just struggling a little bit with Zoom here. Um, Thanks for joining me today for this session. We're going to talk a little bit about what do we know about reading comprehension. And I've had you look at a text here. We're going to come back to that in a second. We're going to spend some time in the next 45 minutes or so talking a little bit about what do we know about reading comprehension, how does it happen, what enables it for students. We just want to start by recognizing that we are meeting today on the ancestral territories of the Tawasin people and other Hunkaminam speaking people, and we are grateful for that. Grateful for the sunshine. I'm grateful for the sunshine and the beauty of this land that we get to live and work and play on. And so, started with this text, a little bit of text for you. This text comes from, I did my master's a bunch of years ago, and I had a course on philosophical hermeneutics, and we spent the entire course reading one book by a guy named Gadamer, a German philosopher, 20th century. I've never struggled through a book more in my entire life. It was about 700 pages of text like this. And maybe there's a good chance that everyone here is more capable than I am, but I've never struggled more with a text in my life than I did with this. And I still don't, I spent a whole course talking about parts of it, still don't really understand what it was about myself. But the question for you is kind of what, if you flip through some of that, what makes a text like this difficult to understand? If it was difficult, maybe some of you figured it out, no problem. So maybe just in the chat, what makes text difficult to understand, that one or other ones? Just take 30 seconds. You can drop that into the chat. Or if anyone wants to grab the mic, you can do that. Yeah, so we got vocabulary coming up a lot, background knowledge coming up a lot, the language choice, the wordiness, yeah. And not written the way we speak, which is really interesting. Okay, perfect. So we're going to talk about kind of all those things a little bit here today. So what makes it difficult is that, on the one hand, reading is not simple. This is one current among many current models of what reading looks like. So when we're trying to help kids to read better, this is all the things that are going on, incredibly complex. And so this is not easy work. And what I hope we talk about today doesn't cause, it's not meant to cause any guilt or added kind of expectations, because this is really different, really different work. And there's a lot of pieces coming together to make reading happen. Reading is like magic. Like the amount of things that are going on in our brain unconsciously when we read is quite mind-blowing, that I've come to realize the more I've read about it, particularly the last couple of years. The next 45 minutes or so, I got lots of slides. I'll share the slides at the end because there's lots of stuff in them that you may be interested in. And it's a bit theoretical, this one. A little bit, maybe if you're in the vocabulary one last time. This one's a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more nerdy that way. But the slides are there, and I've tried to add some links of practical things throughout. But basically, one of the most current accepted models among educational researchers around comprehension is what's called the construction integration model by this researcher Kint. And this is kind of one of the more kind of respected or accepted models across the world of cognitive science. And it basically has a couple components. And I'll use this building to explain it. If you wanted to understand a building, comprehend a building, we're going to start with the smallest piece, which is what's called the microstructures. And so microstructures are things like how, at the smallest level, how walls are held up, how wiring happens, all the engineering around the small little details, even with just holding up a room or hanging a light, or, the really small levels of structure. okay, which then come together into the macro structure of the whole piece, okay? And there's an interplay. There has to be a kind of an alignment between the microstructures and how all those little bits of engineering and design come together in the smallest way to put together this whole building that then stands, right? And then you've also got what's called the situation that it sits in. To understand that building is not just understanding the electricity and the drywall and the things that are behind the walls, as well as understanding the whole building. It's also understanding its time and place, its location, why it's there, what was there before it. All of those things kind of come together for us to understand, we would say, what a building is. Okay, if you apply that to reading, the smallest level of microstructure in this comprehension model is right at the phrase or the sentence level. And comprehension starts there. It starts with understanding sentences. Okay, and sentences are, as we'll look at a couple, are the ability to understand sentences requires in itself a lot of background knowledge and inferencing. So if a reader understands those microstructures of phrases and sentences, then they get put together into a macro structure, which is the understanding of that text. And you're kind of going back and forth. Like a good reader is building the macro structure of the whole text as they're reading, as they're piecing together the microstructure, right? So if you think of a short story, you're a good reader. The act of reading is you're understanding the words, the phrases, the connections between the phrases, and then those are building a narrative. And you're constantly going back and forth between the direction of the narrative and then back to the set, and you're kind of checking for alignment. That's all called the text base in this model. And so the text base is, do you understand what the text is actually saying, right? Just within the text. And then we layer on our knowledge, and our knowledge is kind of playing a role all that way through. We layer on that to what's called the situational model, which is beyond the text. Do we have a sense of how this text fits into other topics? Do we have a sense of what it connects to? Who I bring as myself to this text as well? So that's kind of everything beyond the text, from myself to the world around me, all kind of builds a deep understanding. So let me give you an example here. And again, one of the key messages here is going to be that every step of reading requires background knowledge. So if you'll have a look at this sentence, I didn't even order that book, but the mailman left it on my porch in the rain, so now I guess I'm stuck with it, right? Think of the bits of information that you would need to know in order to understand that sentence. You need to know some vocabulary, but there's some gaps in there. And it's inevitable in every piece of text that some information is left out. An author cannot say everything about everything in every piece of text. So there's some information that's left out. And what's left out in this, even just to understand this sentence at the microstructure, you have to understand that the word book then becomes the it and the it. So that's what you're being stuck with, right? That's a level of understanding. You have to understand that when you leave a book on the porch in the rain, it gets wet. And when a book gets wet, it gets damaged. And when a book is damaged, you can't return it. So those are all bits of knowledge that are in the background that are inference. That's what inferencing is. Inferencing is us being able to fill in the gaps that are not stated in a sentence or in a paragraph or text or whatever. So that's an example, even just of the microstructure at the sentence level, right? And then here's a couple other sentences. Robert desperately wanted to buy a new bicycle, so he took an after-school job sweeping out the bodega around the corner from his family's apartment. That text base again, just understanding the sentence. So the microstructure is, again, you have to understand that the he in the second sentence is the pronoun Robert from the one before. Just those connections between sentences requires students to understand how pronouns work, right? You also have to understand sort of to step up from this, what's the connection between the job and the bicycle, right? To understand that he is taking the job to get the bicycle, right? It's not stated. That's the inference that is required to understand that text, right? You also start to get a picture more broadly of who Robert is. Robert is somebody maybe who's a character who is showing initiative. We could maybe make some inferences about Robert's his social economic status, right? He wants a bicycle, and so he has to go get a job himself. So that says something about the fact that maybe his family doesn't have the funds to buy him a bicycle, so he's going to do it himself. So there's all these inferences that are going on that require deep amounts of background knowledge. And then the situation model around those two sentences would be, well, what do we know about where are bodegas? Like, that word brings a whole bunch of world knowledge with it. And then we start to think about our connections to what would it be like to be him? What are people we know that are like him? What sort of character is he, and how might we identify with him? So those are all the things that are going on just in 2 sentences. Okay. How this works is back to the model, the way reading works, once we've got those models constructed of the text-based and the situation model, we understand the text. A reader actually then is integrating that constantly with whatever knowledge they currently have in their mind. Whatever background knowledge they have is constantly being both used and changed by reading. And this is what learning is. Learning is that change in long-term memory. And so what's really key here is that when we talk about knowledge, all that knowledge that we bring to the text helps a reader understand and comprehend. And when you comprehend something, you get new knowledge, and that then feeds back in. And so if you're in the last workshop with Jason and I, we shared this slide that successful reading uses skills, strategies, knowledge, and vocabulary. And as students read successfully, they increase their knowledge base, they increase their vocabulary, they get more fluent with decoding. What that does is the more they do that, then successful readers read more. They want to read more. They're successful. And as they read more, they encounter more complicated texts, and then they read those successfully. And so the thing about reading is it's self-extending, is what Jason said in the last one. Another way that it often gets talked about, which I think is really helpful, is what you'll often hear in the reading world, or in even beyond that, the learning world, is something called the Matthew effect, which comes from the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament, which is that at one point Jesus says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's what's happening. That's what happens in all areas of learning, and particularly in reading, is that reading begets more reading, because good readers come with a whole bunch of knowledge and background and vocabulary, and they read successfully, so they learn more. And the more they learn, the more they want to read. And what happens is there's lots of graphs of kind of successful learners who the gap grows because knowledge is self-extending. So that's what we're up against when we're thinking about comprehension. So one of the authors that we really like around reading is called Nell Duke. And here's what she says are 3 of the advantages that skilled readers bring to texts. One of them is, try again, there we go. They have greater text processing. So these are 3 things we're going to focus on today. They have greater text processing through increased automatic word recognition. We'll talk about that in a second. They bring a broader base of background knowledge to reading, and they utilize skills and strategies to monitor comprehension and extend understanding. Okay, there are other ones. For example, vocabulary is incredibly powerful and research supported. So we'll kind of get to that a little bit. But basically, this first one, a little bit of background on how reading works. This is the model that we're starting to talk more and more about here in Delta, is that successful reading is actually a combination of 2 different kind of areas of knowledge. And one of the left side, the blue stuff, tends to be things that we get into place a little more, we focus on more, a bit more in the primary, right? Not necessarily, we want to be always building vocabulary and background knowledge, but the things in K-3, it's really important that kids start to come away with concepts of print, which is an understanding of what books are, what sentences are, how to read left to right, all of that. Phonics and phonemic awareness are sort of the development of the letters, the letter sounds, and really important. Phonemic awareness is the ability to understand how the sounds that are within words and how to play with them. And more research is really emphasizing that that's a place that is often where struggling readers struggle, is the ability to hear and play with sounds. And so we're really we're pushing into that with K-3 quite a bit right now and really helping develop those. And all of that develops what's called automatic word recognition, or the ability to just see a word and instantly know what it is. And once those are in place, and the other things, then the things that start to build up successful reading is their vocabulary and their background knowledge. So once the left side sort of gets in place, the right side, the red stuff, just becomes increasingly important. So for intermediate teachers, ideally, that's the place where we're trying to build. We know that not all students are coming out of K-3 with all the decoding skills, but we're trying to work on that. And so this idea of near recognition is being able to just see words and instantly recognize them. And research is showing that that when students decode a word successfully, if they decode it between 1 to 5 times, typically, then that becomes automatic in the brain. And it's those students with weak phonemic awareness. It's actually, I found this really fascinating myself over the last couple of years as we've really dove into the reading research, is it's the sound of the words and our vocabulary, the richness of our vocabulary, of the sound of the words, which is becoming increasingly important to how reading happens. And so readers who don't have that ability to hear and play with the sounds in words have a harder time developing visual decoding. And that extra, any little bit of slowing down to have to figure out words as going through a text just delays the brain enough that fluency drops significantly. And so that ability of being able to instantly recognize words is what reduces the cognitive load or the strain on the brain so that fluency goes up and that comprehension goes up. So that's a little bit kind of maybe beyond the work in intermediate, but it's something to really be aware of. And we've got some places where we're playing around with how might we increase phonemic awareness and decoding skills in our intermediate students, because we know that that's where struggling readers often struggle. So let's go to the next section, which is around now background knowledge. Once decoding, what the research is really saying is once that sort of level of decoding and automatic word recognition is in place, background knowledge becomes the biggest correlation with successful reading. So here's kind of an example, kind of a classic one. Comes up a lot in the reading research, and it's been done with other topics as well, but this one's called the baseball study. And basically they took some students and gave them a text on baseball, and then asked them some comprehension questions both during and after. And what happens is if they lumped the students into 4 different categories: students who are good readers, high reading ability, and they knew baseball really well. And that's what you see on the left here. So that's the highest functioning scoring group on comprehension. At the bottom here, we have students who have low reading ability before this, and they don't know much about baseball. Okay, so they scored the poorest on this. Now, what's really interesting is the groups in the middle. And what this study has shown, and lots of others, is that students with low reading ability, but high knowledge on the topic, baseball, score higher on comprehension than students who actually had higher reading abilities but lower knowledge. Okay, so what it basically means is knowledge, background knowledge is such a key piece of unlocking comprehension. And we want students to understand more and more texts. We don't just need to increase their reading ability, we need to increase their background knowledge, right? So which makes comprehension very difficult to work on in a sense, because building up background knowledge is not something you do in a week or a month. It's something that happens over the course of many, many years, right? So what many kind of advocates for reading are saying is that we need to be focusing on knowledge acquisition all the way through school, but particularly sort of once that initial K-3 decoding is in place, those intermediate years are really key for developing a wide knowledge base. So why does it matter? High correlation. The more you know about a topic, the easier it is to read it, comprehend it, and integrate new information. It's sort of a foundational component of cognitive science that knowledge breeds knowledge breeds knowledge. We remember, the more we know something, the more we remember it, the more it sticks, the more we can use it, everything. And so those who know things learn faster, read faster, remember more. We talked about those sentences that authors can provide certain details in knowledge based on their purpose, and knowledge fills in those gaps. And if you don't have some of that, then you're not understanding even at that microstructure level at the sentence level. Students will struggle if they can't fill in the inferences that are missing even at the sentence level. Background knowledge is connected to vocabulary. You can almost use vocabulary as a proxy for knowledge, because if you know a word, let's say like the word democracy, if I know that word, I know a whole bunch of knowledge behind it. And words are complicated, some more than others. Words are whole schemas of knowledge. Schemas are connected webs of knowledge. And so when we're reading, we're bringing that entire, when you read the word as an adult, as an educated adult, you read that word democracy in a text, you're bringing your entire life learning of democracy and that term to that word every time you read it, right? And so vocabulary is just incredibly important to reading comprehension. It also helps you monitor comprehension. If you understand a topic and then you're reading in it, it doesn't align. It's your knowledge that kind of provides the standard. There's an interesting phrase I came across recently called the standard of cohesion, which is basically as readers are going through sentence by sentence and they're building a model of that text, their background knowledge becomes like the standard that they're holding that knowledge up against to go, okay, does this make sense? Does it not make sense? How does this compare to what I currently think? And that's what makes a good reader. And if you don't have that, then you're just going through it and sort of maybe not doing the same self-checking. Similarly, it acts as a roadmap for a text, which allows, kind of provides the main points of where we're going. And then readers aren't distracted by sort of tangential points or additional details or anything. Oops, so that's it. So incredibly important that knowledge, kind of what knowledge does to reading. What does it mean to be knowledge focused on a text? So how do we read text for knowledge? And some of this is similar to what we talked about in the last one with Jason, but basically we want to be aware of the vocabulary that students are reading. We talked in the last session about short text, and I think we believe that's powerful because it allows us to kind of focus on these things, that we want to focus on what vocabulary might be needed, what background knowledge might be needed. We want to stay within the text as much as possible in that text base and build understanding of that text base, including some of the complex sentences that may be the key points in a text, okay? Because complex sentences are often complex because they have prepositions that show relation of cause and effect, or correlation, or why something causes something. And so those complex sentences are really important to unpack so that students understand sort of the main concept of the text. Rereading is really powerful as well for having students go back over text multiple times, which again, short texts allows that to happen more easily on. And we want students to be able to discuss. And students need to have the opportunity, all of us learners need to have the opportunity to process and talk about whatever we're reading. If we just read a text and think we understand it, but never speak what we think it is, write what we think it is, process it, explain it, wrestle with it, then the learning just does not stick as much as it does when we have that processing time. Okay. Some other things that are really important to do. One is we want to be providing those graphic organizers or other thinking processes around that text, and specific to the type of thinking that text requires. If it's a narrative, then it's sort of that sort. We might be having students think about that story structure throughout. But there's different types. I'll send you this. I'll put the slides in at the end, and there's an interesting little piece of one of the Nell Duke articles I pulled out with a link here, and it talks about, I think it's 6 different structures of informational text, things like cause and effect or description, and it helps to think through sort of what are the actual ways of thinking that we want students to engage in with this text. Another thing is really powerful is retrieval practice. I've got a info sheet on retrieval practice. It's basically just having students go back to things again. So if you read a text on whatever it is, the next day, coming back to it, what do we remember? What were some of the words? If you do some preloading of vocabulary in order to read a text, come back to those vocabulary words a day later or a couple days later. And the more we do that, the more we ask students to recall information without supports, so without the aids of sort of any memory supports, like reading it again, then the more they're going to remember those words and remember that information and be able to integrate it. And so there's a bunch of information there and strategies I've given on retrieval practice. And the last one is around another really powerful tool that we're talking a lot in Delta over the last year is a book called The Writing Revolution, which is using writing prompts to structure thinking. And so Janet Thompson, one of our coordinators, has done a ton of work on The Writing Revolution. In the slides here, there's a link to a bunch of info and videos. But the basic 2 ideas behind the Writing Revolution text is that when we teach good, simple writing techniques, we're actually teaching thinking. And so by following up a reading exercise with a good writing exercise, then we're processing, we're scaffolding the thinking that we want students to do about that text. And the thing that I really like about the Writing Revolution is that they start with the ideas that sentences are building blocks and that we just need to focus on sentences, even just up to grade 7. If we just focus on sentence writing, and I know that as teachers, I spent a lot of my time as an intermediate teacher, and I would want students to try to write a lot. That sometimes it feels like getting kids to write a lot feels better to us. The approach that the Writing Revolution takes is let's get them to write a lot shorter, even just focusing on sentences, but sentences that process thinking in different ways and understanding how to connect ideas and process ideas. And so the Writing Revolution is a really great tool, a great book. And if you're interested in that, you can let me know. And again, there's the link here. We'll give you lots of info on the Writing Revolution. So how about because I've been talking now for 25 minutes or so. Let me throw you into just some breakout rooms, and I'll give you just a couple minutes what has jumped out so far with you. That's a lot of information. What's kind of jumped out so far? And I'll give you 3 minutes in some breakout rooms and go. Oops. Go. Okay, let me keep going because we got one more section here I wanted to talk about, and we're quickly running out of time. But the other section, the last topic I wanted to talk about was reading strategies, because reading strategies are kind of add to this complexity as well. And so we have reading strategies have been have been a huge part of the message around what makes successful reading for a bunch of decades. And one of the assumption, or kind of the general sense that I have and that we have here, is that when teachers are thinking about reading strategies, so things like being able to summarize and predict and inference and synthesize and all those types of things, we often see them as outcomes. And so we read a text so that we get better at finding the main idea or predicting or being able to summarize or any of those things, okay? And we also have this, I think there's a general sort of sense, and I might be wrong, but the sense I have is that we want students to practice those so they get better at them, right? We want students to get better at predicting. And we think that if students aren't comprehending something well, that they just need to practice the skills of finding the main idea, or finding the skill of predicting, or finding the skill of inferencing, okay? The challenge with that, or the problem with that, is that there's more and more sort of a belief in the world of research and cognitive science that those things aren't actually how reading happens. So this is, again, maybe a little bit in tension with some of the things you may currently be doing or thinking. But as an example, here's one from an article that came out from Johns Hopkins University in partnership with a large organization called Learning First. And they had an article that came out last year called "The Problem with Finding the Main Idea in a Text." And here's what it says. Students do not need practice finding the main idea in a text because it isn't a skill. It's something a reader can do when she or he actually understands the world. And that would be that text base that we talked about before, that the passage is talking about. And here's that sort of gap. Ironically, by narrowing the curriculum to put more emphasis on the mastery of reading skills, what has actually been achieved is a widening of the gap between the more and less advantaged among our students. What less advantaged students need is more knowledge, not more strategy practice, right? So that's a potentially different approach than things that you may be thinking or doing, or that have been talked about. And so what we are now trying to do is maybe move that scale a little bit towards not just seeing reading strategies as an outcome that you get better at, but they do play a role. This is the complexity of reading strategies, is that they do actually work from a research perspective, right? But they work in the sense that they actually help deepen the understanding, and that we use them to improve comprehension of what it is we're talking about. The end goal is not getting better at those strategies. The end goal is understanding what you're reading more and building the knowledge about that thing, right? Which is a little bit different. So for example, when we think about back to this model, and we think about, I just listed some of the reading strategies that we often get talked about. These things actually exist within the model. They don't exist outside of it. So it's not as though we read these texts and our reading strategies over on the side, are somehow getting better. It's that they're all a part of it. So for example, if you think of inferring is sort of filling in any background knowledge that's missing, or filling in the assumptions. Well, we infer at the basic level of sentence understanding. We infer and fill in those gaps when we're piecing together the sentences in a text to understand a paragraph, and when we understand how a character shows up in a story and what that tells us about that character that isn't directly stated. That's all within the text. And inferring is an interesting one, because inferring we infer our whole lives. We infer from the day we're born, because inferring is filling in the hidden meanings of what's happening around us. And so we don't actually get better at inferring as a skill without increasing our background knowledge on a topic. But the more we have background knowledge on a topic, the more deeply and rich our background knowledge is on a topic, the more we can bring to those gaps in a text, right? So if you take a minute and maybe think about any of those skills on the left-hand side, those reading strategies, how would they fit into this model here as you see it? You can just kind of think through, pick one and then go, okay, where would self-monitoring, self-checking your reading happen? And how would it get better? I'll give you a minute to think about that. All right, we're pretty much out of time here. There's a couple quick slides to get through. So and please hear me, what we're saying here, what I'm saying is not that we don't do reading strategies at all, but here's what they actually offer students. Reading strategies are tools to be an active reader. An active reader, consciously or unconsciously, is predicting. They are making inferences. They are checking their understanding. They are, does that make sense? Does that make sense? They are things that are happening during the text, and they help me be an active reader. So yes, we want students to be learning them and using them. They help with self-monitoring, noticing when we're not understanding something. And that standard of cohesion, that I'm reading a text and then I'm holding it up against my own understanding of that topic, right? They help process concepts or knowledge. So using, being asked to synthesize, to visually represent a text or the ideas within a text, creating a story map. These are all things that help us understand that text better. They aren't things that we practice to get better at. And they give us language to talk about with others and to socially process and collaboratively process our learning. What they offer teachers is, when you see students trying to use reading strategies, what they tell you is how well the student understood the text. They don't tell you how well a student can inference. They don't tell you how well a student can predict outside of that text. Because remember, this is maybe a subtle shift, but a kind of a key one to wrestle with, that if a student's difficulty in performing a reading strategy with a particular text does not mean they need more practice with that strategy. It means that there's something missing in their comprehension of that text, which is very different, right? Potentially, it could be different than what you're thinking. And so that goes back to right at the very beginning. If a student's struggling to understand a text, it could be their decoding. It could be their phonemic awareness. Is that foundational piece hasn't been developed enough, that their decoding is too slow and they're not able to fluently read it. It doesn't mean that they're not a good predictor. It doesn't mean that they can't find the main idea as a skill. It means that they don't know the main idea of that text yet because they haven't comprehended it yet. So it's complicated. And what's happening, we know, is that students reading difficulties, often with a certain percentage of students, a certain group, can look like they're coming out of grade 3, grade 4 reading really well because the complexity of the text hasn't required any comprehension yet. And so some of those key decoding things haven't been tested enough, and they start to appear more and more if there hasn't been enough foundational skill development. And so that's why we're really trying to work at K to 3 a lot around phonics, phonemic awareness right now. A couple last quick things. I know we're past the time here. So yes, using strategies, teaching strategies can boost comprehension, but it does not make up for the other things that need to be there. And then some questions around, what do you do with reading strategies? How much do you do it? The research is saying just a few lessons on, what predicting is or what inferencing is. don't spend weeks and weeks and weeks practicing a strategy, because we'd rather spend weeks and weeks and weeks on a topic, right? Because we're trying to build knowledge, not build strategy use. We want to maximize the amount of time students read. What's coming out in some areas of the reading research is that classrooms can be so focused on strategies and all these things that sort of surround reading, processes and discussions, that they're not actually just reading enough. And so we want to really just try to foreground as much reading as possible. Focusing on a bunch of strategies at once is more helpful than one at a time. We want students to be in charge of the strategies, and what they're for comprehension. Readers, again, I've said this already, but readers don't get better at strategies necessarily, but they do get more habitual at using them, thinking about how to use them, and then more critical of using them. So it's this funny mix of good readers use them, so we want to focus on them, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is increased knowledge and comprehension. I'll skip that because we don't have time. And here's the kind of the last, and then we'll wrap up here. The last thing, which is I find both, maybe you'll find both interesting and hopeful, as well as kind of the challenge of it, is that when we start to think of it this way, reading comprehension is a long game in a sense that building up background knowledge and vocabulary is not something that's going to happen overnight. This was an interesting article that, again, from that Nell Duke, who we've been reading a bunch. And this was an article she cited that said they did a study where if students had 2 years of strong teachers of reading comprehension, all students progress, including students that are more vulnerable in their background knowledge and vocabulary. However, if they only have one student or one teacher in a row, then only 25% of the students will make progress, and any of those vulnerable students won't progress. So it's such a long game that any one of you can't do it on your own, but we can make a difference if it's a focus over time. And so what gives me hope is if we have groups of intermediate teachers in particular, I think grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that can align some of the things they're doing, and we start to build up knowledge and vocabulary. Vocabulary is hugely important and hugely supported in the research over time. So the last thing I'll just put up here, and if you want to kind of do this as your own practice after, as we wrap up here, one of the things in that writing revolution that I mentioned is the first strategy they talk about in the book is using the because, but, so. So having students write sentences that require a because, a but, and a so. 3 sentences, right? So we have because explains why something is true, but indicates a change of direction, and so tells us what will happen as a result of that. So had I not run out of time, what I was going to get you to do is even complete these 3 sentences. Reading comprehension is a long game because, and you can fill that in if you like to kind of test your thinking. Reading comprehension is a long game, but reading comprehension is a long game, so. All right, so that's my last thing for you today. Thank you. I will put this last slide up here so you can see it, and I will also put the slides right now in the chat for you. There you go. I know that was a lot of information. The slides have extra links and a bit more sort of practical resources and things in there. Definitely reach out if you have questions or ideas or things that you want to share with me, or if you got places that you want to work on particular things around this, either individually as a school, let me know, and I would be more than happy to help out, and our reading team here would. So there you go. Thank you for joining. Hopefully that was useful for you and it didn't overwhelm with too much information. We've recorded it, and I'll send that out, and the slides are there too. Enjoy the rest of your day.